Hi, thank you everyone for being here. We have a very interesting lecture today with us, and it talks about architectural history through a very different perspective. You all must have already kind of read about the note uh, that has been shared all over. It's called the Urbanism of Plaster, and why it's interesting is because it takes the take of history through material anthropology, understanding the histories of city through studying the history of a material. So this lecture approaches architectural history and critique from the standpoint of architectural materials, specifically plaster, and it's primarily looking at 20th century India, where the use of cement and concrete kind of increases during the 20th century, and and also the use of these materials like concrete and plaster is promoted by a lot of companies and industries. So, but we have not really looked at how this kind of came into the mainstream and become an everyday material for us. And this lecture is kind of going to open up all these questions and how plaster became an important kind of material in our everyday building industry, and kind of relook at how our notions of building durability, the ideas of kacha pakka housing or permanent and temporary houses are framed through the use of this material. So I'll not kind of leak out more information and let Curt kind of elaborate on that. But to give you more information about Curt, Curt Gambetta is a PhD candidate at the Princeton University in US. Formerly, he was the Rainer Banham Fellow at the University of Buffalo in New York and a teaching fellow at Woodbury University School of Architecture in Los Angeles. Since 2003, he is the moderator of Urban Study Group E-List for the Sarai program of CSDS, where he was also a resident in 2002 and 3, and also 4 and 5. He also kind of has a design research practice, which has included a number of public installations, salons, and symposia in Bangalore and different places like Bangalore, Los Angeles, Buffalo, and Houston, with a focus on the architecture of infrastructural systems such as waste, streets, and street lighting. So, Curt has also been visiting India frequently since long ago, and he has kind of spent some time here, and he's back here shortly, and he'll be back for a longer time in the next year, probably. So I invite Curt to deliver his lecture and share with us his thoughts. Welcome, Curt.
Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank everybody here for the invitation to Anuj and Prasad for putting this together. It's also really nice to be here to speak to both friends and also people that I've learned from. I was just telling Nina some of her work, even 10, 15 years ago, was work that I first encountered when I came to start doing research in 2002, 2003. So it's actually really nice to be here and speak with you all. So I want to start actually with a quote from the anthropologist Tim Ingold. Actually, could somebody tell me if I always hate it when people go on for like more than 45, 50 minutes. So if it's getting really long, please tell me. And I'd actually rather open things up for discussion. But so this is a quote from anthropologist Tim Ingold. He says, "We commonly describe materials as raw but never cooked, for by the time they have congealed into objects, they have already disappeared. Thenceforth, it is the objects themselves that capture our attention, no longer the materials of which they are made. It is as though our material involvement begins only when the stucco has already hardened on the house front or the ink already dried on the page. We see the building and not the plaster of its walls, the words and not the ink with which they were written." So I'm kind of interested in the implications of this. I mean, Timothy Ingold is thinking from
audible in behind.
Okay.
I'll
Okay, is this better? Sorry. So kind of why I bring, kind of put this quote on the table is, I'm interested in going, in a sense, beyond the qualities of things. So we like to talk about the kind of, especially the kind of visual qualities of materials, or even the kind of sensorial qualities of materials. I imagine these are issues that have come up, for instance, in some of the experiments that sit behind you. Again, what we see and feel. And I'm actually interested in kind of going beyond that, not totally removing those experiences, but also thinking about how materials are used, who uses them, how they circulate, so how certain materials like cement and concrete actually proliferate throughout the 20th century and even in the 21st century, and how their properties change in response to other materials. I think one of my arguments today, even though I'll be looking at cement, I'm interested in how certain materials depend on each other, historically speaking. We tend to think of concrete architecture as having a kind of historical role in the history of architecture in the 20th century as something kind of different from, say, the assembly that would be required for steel or even wood frame construction. But I actually think what we find when we look historically, and especially when we look to even more quotidian and everyday contexts of construction and architecture, that we see that certain materials depend on each other. So one thing I want to think about today is, how materials are connected to conceptions of time. Anuj mentioned this, about these questions of durability, of how time moves forward or backward, fast or slow. And so I think of popular conceptions of the use of cement and the acceleration not only of construction, but of many aspects of life, which I'll kind of talk about in the context of the lecture. And so materials, I would say, are a question of time. On the one hand, how long do they last? Which is, of course, there in the kind of distinction made between the pakka and the kacha, which, as we know, is also not just used to talk about architecture, but so many things, like even the financial industry, personhood, and so on. But here, in other words, like, how durable are materials? How long do they last? Are they considered permanent? Can their time be extended through maintenance? These are not benign questions. These are actually very political questions, always. And in many ways, these are questions where architecture becomes political through the use of materials and through their maintenance over time. So this is just two images that I actually took on a walk this morning in Bandra at Mount Mary Basilica. So here, a wax fetish from Mount Mary Basilica, the use of something ephemeral, which is wax, to assure the construction of a durable, permanent pakka home. Also, when we think of utopian projects in the context of 20th century India, such as Shantiniketan or Oroville, for instance, a number of projects in Western India. Here, the kind of use of clay or mud and Shantiniketan, which is sealed in black tar, which raises the kind of issue of maintenance, which is both a kind of temporal question and a question of labor. So how often is it renewed, and who's responsible for renewing it? These are really important questions because, in a sense, this also asks, gets us to ask, what is the role of the architect in this context? Does the architect kind of remove themselves from this? As we know, in many experiments, such as Shantiniketan, or even, say, Laurie Baker's work, or the kind of proliferation of alternative building technologies, such as mud, after the 1980s and 90s, that this question of who is kind of involved in these processes of renewal and maintenance is both very important and also, I'd say, political. So in the history of architecture in the 20th century, time is directly related to how much time it takes to use a material. And I think this is especially important for cement, which is the material I'm going to focus on today. Cement was important in India and much of the world because it was promulgated to rationalize the time of construction and, of course, as we said, assure durability. But I really want to focus on this question of the kind of time of construction and the roles that are associated with that time as things speed up. So cement was thought to induce a kind of division of labor. It made the task of building eminently calculable, and thus divisible. So for instance, and this is not two examples from India, but these are examples from the context of American construction in the late 19th and early 20th century. These are actually tailors of Taylorism fame, tables of calculation, which actually down to net time in minutes, 0.08, calculate how much time it takes to move a bag of cement 2 feet on site. So in a sense, what cement allowed for at a certain moment in American construction, and also the work of contractors such as Hennebik, who are coming out of France, it allowed for the kind of scientific and this kind of extremely precise calculation of tasks. And so even though all of these tasks were affiliated with site-based labor, I would also argue that in a sense, this was a kind of reimagination of architectural labor and the way, and a kind of thinking of the way in which labor was divided between skill and menial tasks, but also between creative labor and work. Another example would be Ernest Ransom's system, which was really important to industrial construction at the turn of the century, which was basically, in a sense, what we're looking at is an idea that things are prefabricated next to the building site or off-site, or before a building season begins, and then brought to the site when the weather is amenable to it, and then constructed. But in a sense, the kind of objective of these systems was to quicken construction, to speed up aspects of design and construction on site. So, but the kind of uses and users of cement, I would say, were more open than industry and the professions imagined in India and elsewhere, I think, in the post-colonial world. And I think one could even say in Europe and the United States, what I think people often call the West. The infrastructure of cement powder supported a litany of openings and unintended consequences, some of which I'll talk about today in the context of urban Bangalore. It relaxed the boundaries between expert and inexpert design, between knowledge and know-how. But it was also subject to delay. At times it was unavailable, untrusted, or simply unsuccessful in modernizing construction. For instance, Romy Khosla referred to the Indian building site in 1982 in an issue of the Journals of Arts and Ideas as a tableau of what he called tomb technology and ways of slaves. So Romy Khosla's lament here, his disappointment, I think, underscores a larger sentiment, especially in the 1970s and 80s, that construction in India was held back by underdevelopment. But stasis or delay, or situations of technical failure, in this case, the issue of kind of mechanization of construction never really kind of transpiring in the way that it was imagined in the mid-20th century in India. These are not circumstances between a beginning and end point in progress or technological development, I would argue. I think in looking at the slow introduction of cement during the middle period of the 20th century, I want to suggest an attention to architectural production in a time of temporal delay and technological deferral as a condition in its own right. We tend to think of these as as failures in a way, as failures of technology, of expertise, of modernization. But I actually think we need to consider these kind of situations on their own terms. These distinctions between the kind of failure of modernization and its success often get mapped onto the West and the non-West. I actually don't think it's that clean in any sense. But regardless, I think I'm interested in really getting into what happens when, say, for instance, mechanization does not transpire, which was the case for much of the world in the 20th century. So I think in taking account of this requires an attention to smaller, more fine-grained experiences of design and construction than are typically associated with cement and concrete. We think of even buildings at this scale, but as we know, in so much of India and much of the world, cement really permeates construction on a much smaller scale, which is really going to be the focus of my discussion today. So in much of smaller scale architecture in mid-20th century India, new cement construction was a modest adaptation of the spaces that preceded it, relegating more radical transformations of space to the architecture of infrastructure, government, and cultural spaces such as theaters and cinema halls. So in the architecture of homes, shops, and other facets of urban life, cement's qualities of plasticity and durability were exploited most profoundly in the design of surface, not the design of space. Experimentation, I'm arguing here today, happened on the surface in a thin layer of plaster, which I think was a modest effort to make the most of what cement, colored paint, and other materials afforded. These are two images of a cinema hall, which back in, I think, 2007, a kind of probably 1920s, 30s era cinema hall in the cantonment in Bangalore was being renovated. But again, what's interesting to me here is is that design is happening on the surface, right? In that there's not a kind of deep rethinking of the kind of structure in this context, but actually a kind of layering and kind of minor building up in a way to basically totally reorient the architecture, or at least make the cinema hall look new. So I think much of this work that I'm talking about, this kind of smaller scale, this working in kind of surface and plaster, and then later in these kind of frames, which are really more contemporary, this kind of labor was at odds with the division of labor that was anticipated for materials like cement by the industry and by architects and engineers. So in mid-20th century India, cement was promulgated as a means to reorganize the role of design and construction in society. And it played no small part in the rise of the civil engineer and the professional architect, and the deskilling of construction labor, which is well known for. Yet, I think as in much of the world, many of the technologies and experts associated with its propagation in the West and colonial centers of power materialized unevenly, if at all, historically speaking, or were simply too expensive for newly urban publics. So the adaptation of industrialized prefabricated building technologies to a labor-intensive and increasingly unskilled building economy required a good degree, I would argue, of making do, a kind of form of experimental culture that remains, I think, poorly theorized in architecture, except as a kind of foil or palliative to modern design or planning. So for instance, I'm thinking here of the kind of way that bricolage, for instance, or even jugaad are celebrated as a kind of alternative. I suppose I'm questioning these distinct. Is this still on? It is, right? Okay, sorry. I just heard this noise as though there was like I turned it off. So in order to kind of tease out the infrastructure of cement, today I want to look to the proliferation of cement in Bangalore in the decades surrounding independence. Walking through the streets, homes, and cinema halls of Bangalore, what I want to describe today is forms of substitution, adaptation, and other kinds of ad hoc invention that were taken up by a new class of builders during the transition to Portland cement. And so what I think hopefully we can talk about and I want to kind of raise is this question of transition. We think we have a kind of image, I think, both in history and I think even in contemporary architectural discourse, that when new technologies are introduced, that they replace old technologies. And as they replace old technologies, they also replace many of the actors that were envisioned for expertise in the use of cement, steel, wood, or any other technology. I think this would also go for the turn to, say, parametrics and other kind of digital forms of labor that we work with now. So, in a sense, the kind of the work that I'm going to talk about that was kind of undertaken with cement and other older forms of plaster and mortar was undertaken by migrant labor and local craftsmen. And in a sense, it was a kind of mixture of old and new actors. But I'd say that this kind of labor of accommodating old and new technologies, as well as old and new forms of expertise, was also, I think, part and parcel of the work of architects and engineers, who sought to adapt new images and technologies of modern design to the day-to-day realities of construction in cities such as Bangalore. So I think this is important to the context of what I'm discussing today, which is that I'm not here pitting the vernacular against the work of the architect. I actually am trying to make an argument that new technologies of cement and kind of new, basically new materialities of urban proliferation in mid-20th century Bangalore and I think other Indian cities in some ways confronted the architect with a similar set of problems, actually, as other workers. And so I would hesitate to actually say that this paper is about bringing into visibility, say, an urban vernacular as such. Because I actually think, as I hope I can show, like that there was a lot of traffic in terms of new designs, new techniques, new uses for materials between architects and contractors, masonry, and so on. And so in this sense, in looking at this traffic, I'm interested in how, in a sense, cement redistributed roles about design in Bangalore. In a sense, opening up the possibility of design and technical achievement to users and publics that otherwise historically hadn't had access to it. So materials hot and cold. So cement, as we know, is cool in the hands. And gade, which is a type of mortar that predated cement in South India, can be hot to touch during its manufacture, which is forged by crushing lime or tunum and sand in a circular stone channel with an ox-driven stone wheel. So the kind of subtleties of these materials, I would say, belie a deeper series of distinctions about their relationship to modernity. Unlike industrial-derived cement, gade manufacturing drew from a spatial and material economy that was embedded in familiar natural substrates and urban geographies. It was composed of a mixture of plant and animal-based extracts and earthen media. So eggs, for instance, were used as an additional coat on the wall surface in order to smooth out lime mortar. Jaggery and boron extract, which is a crushed, soaked in water, and decanted, were mixed with lime in order to waterproof the roof, flat roofs in Bangalore, which was also sometimes referred to in Bangalore as Untitled Plaster. Surkey mortar supplemented this mixture with brick powder and was used for the construction of terraced roofs, consisting of bricks laid obliquely on top of a supporting set of wood beams. Tunum, which was both a kind of exterior or surfacing plaster of lime and, as I said, a component of gade production, was used as a method of plastering both for masonry construction and mud construction, acting as a cloak to what lay beneath its hard shell. So exterior plastering could be manipulated to a gleaming polish. It could be made to actually look to become something else in a sense, almost unnatural, by a particular process of rubbing involving a careful orchestration of timing, moisture, stone, and coconut. So quarter shells of coconut would be used, which allowed a firm grip and were used to kind of polish the surface, this being used with plant extracts. And so I'm describing all of this in kind of thick detail because I think it's important to think about how all these different materials make a material in a way. And the sense that they are drawn from regional and agrarian economies that are actually brought into the city at this moment in Bangalore's history. So what I'm arguing here is that eggs, sugar, nuts, bricks, lime, and other ingredients for construction inhabited an urban economy of daily life. So lime, once stone or shell, before it's converted to lime, was reduced to a powder and then wetted as tunum in order to bind the leaves together upon, which, as we know, combines areca nut, tobacco, and other additives, and then is chewed in the mouth. The formula for tunum was itself locally derived, drawing from geological resources in inland areas or shell in coastal towns and cities. So what I wanted us to think about here is the spatial and sensory proximity of these reactions, the stimulation of tunum in the mouth when chewed in pan, and the exposure of lime to water, a reaction that Louis Vicat, who was a French engineer, in his treatise on mortars and cements, he describes as a kind of rock that, quote, splits with noise, puffs up, producing a large disengagement of hot, slightly caustic vapor. So gade's familiarity, gade, this kind of regional mortar and plaster, its familiarity to urban experience was reinforced by its manufacture in and around the periphery of Bangalore. So, for instance, when I was spending time doing fieldwork in Bangalore, it often came up that people who lived in the city, who were old enough to remember, not necessarily that old, would recall these kind of gade production units, but basically where this, let's see here, like for instance, where these kind of round stone channels would be sited next to either a kind of large-scale construction project or sited kind of autonomously to provide and provision for neighborhood construction projects. And so what's important here, I think, is that materials and materiality were familiar in these different ways. They were familiar to the sensory, to the body, but also to the kind of everyday life of the city. And so what I think is really important actually in thinking about what changes is two things. One is the question of time when cement is introduced. Because in a sense what happens, what's interesting in speaking to older contractors who worked with Gade in the city is that many of these designs have this kind of deep relief. They have this kind of soft putty-like quality because they can be, a design can be started one day and returned to the next. And so it actually has a very, very different temporality than cement. It can actually be amended, it can be revised, it can be done slowly. Whereas cement, designs in cement here dated nicely for us is 1967, basically kind of collapse the deep relief of basically mortars and plasters, hydraulic lime, that were done in hydraulic lime. They kind of collapse that in a sense and flatten it, and also convert it into shapes that can be constructed relatively easily and by less skilled labor. So for instance, the arrow is a motif that I'll come back to at the end of the paper, but is common across the city in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. But in a sense, in reading these kind of details, I think we also see a kind of changing landscape of expertise and skill in the context of the city. But what I'm trying to say here is that in a sense, this was also because of the kind of materials that workers were using. In a sense that materials like cement were basically started to proliferate in the context of Bangalore, especially by the 1960s and 70s, at a moment when construction was also speeding up. It sped up construction, but it was also meeting the demands of a burgeoning kind of real estate economy. And so in a sense, as we know, and even in the context of Mumbai, this question of cement and speed and fast construction remains very, very kind of important, I would say, as a relationship between materiality and in the context of contemporary Indian real estate speculation. But here what's important is just that, you know, these imply very different kinds of skill. This would have been taken up by what we would now call artisans, people who had specialized in this kind of work, whereas this kind of work in cement was taken up by basically agriculturalists who had migrated to the city in the early 20th to mid 20th century in Bangalore, and had in a sense learned their knowledge of building and architecture on site. Learned on site, not from, say, their parents or from a family member, but actually kind of off the cuff in a sense. And so these are kind of very different histories of skill. The other main kind of distinction that I think is important in thinking about this transition from Gade to cement is this question of space. Like I was saying, Gade had this important role in the city in the sense that it involved materials that were both kind of familiar to everyday life, but its production was also seen and known. Its materials and the things that went into it were known to those who would, say, run this kind of stone-driven wheel, right, around a big, that's driven by an ox. So the kind of things that actually went into making it, how it was made, in a sense, there's a reason people can still remember it, because it was known and familiar to a city like Bangalore. But I would say that it was also part of the kind of culture of design and construction in the city before the figure of the architect and the civil engineer. This is just to show one of the lime containers for making pan. But what I think is important is these are two maps that I'm going to show you. This is from 1927. This is like a report from the late colonial period about the kind of geography of cement, which, as you can see, at this point is organized also around infrastructure, which here is the railroad. And interestingly, by the late 1960s, cement becomes associated with these new large kind of manufacturing and kind of industry towns. even in the context of rural Karnataka. And so cement becomes a kind of map of the nation, in a sense, and of the national economy. But what's interesting to me is that when cement manufacture is kind of displaced to the factory, this was from a publication put out by the ACC in 1967. In a sense that all of those kind of steps and procedures and substrates and kind of materials that go into it become displaced to the factory. They become the domain of the quality control engineer. They become the domain of the civil engineer working for any of the kind of cement research units that were being run by the ACC. So in a sense, we could say that this kind of removed a lot of this everyday knowledge that you would have found with earlier building technologies and displaced it to the factory, in a sense. So in thinking, in marking this transition, in a sense, we see what I guess would be a kind of expected experience of transition, that, industrialization meant that a kind of forgetfulness or disengagement, I would say, with the materiality of things. But I think what's important too, just about cement and gare, is that in fieldwork I actually found that in some ways, at least for a number of decades in Bangalore, these two different materials with these two very different economies, these two very different temporalities and forms of expertise that were associated with them, were actually used very similarly. So you would find, for instance, in older neighborhoods such as Ulsar, that many, many houses that basically were constructed in the image of concrete architecture were actually made in older hydraulic lime plasters like gare. So in a sense, old technologies were made to look like new technologies. And in some cases also, new technologies like cement accommodated for many decades many of the same artisans who had been using older technologies. And I'll kind of show the consequences of this in the context of Bangalore. So these kind of uneven transitions, like this experience where this kind of experience of, on the one hand, a new technology replacing an old, on the other hand, a new technology aping an old technology, or vice versa, in some ways I think troubles the kind of narratives that were basically being propagated by both industry and the architectural profession from the 1940s and 50s onwards. This is an image just to give a sense of the kind of wide swath of publications that were being promulgated and distributed by the Concrete Association in India, which was in a sense the kind of marketing wing and kind of pedagogical wing of the Associated Cement Companies. So, in the context of Bangalore, this issue of popularizing cement, of bringing cement into all these different aspects of daily life, was in some ways an issue of trust. For instance, the cement started to be used in, say, the 1940s for cinema halls. It started to be used, in a sense, for long-span structures, as we know. But it wasn't trusted, and it wasn't trusted by city authorities. And so, for instance, with the State Theater, which was constructed in 1941, the workers there told me that basically the city authorities basically withheld a license to continue construction until they could until the contractor and workers could prove the efficacy and strength of its construction. So what they did was they had 300 bags of 75 kilogram cement placed on the balcony of the cinema hall for 3 months in order to simulate the weight of bodies. Sometimes also I found in the context of fieldwork that houses would only use cement in one part of the house. And while on the surface it seems that's an issue of expense, when I was speaking to contractors, they also said it was an issue of trust, that cement wouldn't be used, for instance, in the back of the house, the space of kind of domesticity. It would instead be used in the foyer, the kind of the entrance, as an experimental space. So it wasn't in the context of Bangalore. It was not used widely, actually, until the 1970s. It wasn't until the 1970s that the use of RCC for construction of roofing, for instance, surpassed the use of tile, slate, shingle, and other technologies. And it's still comprised only at that point about 40% of housing stock in the city. So I think this idea that we have that cement was the kind of material of the kind of the rhetorical expression of Nehruvian socialism and the dam and the factory and so on, and even in the kind of Pakka house to a certain degree, it actually turns out that cement was very slow in coming. I mean, we also know that there was material shortages in the 1970s. There's issues with adulterated cement and so on. And I'm sure some people in the audience are familiar with these books, but what's interesting to me at this moment is that the cement industry was the space for architectural discourse beyond the kind of professional journals. So it was the space where architects communicated their work to a wider audience. And so publications such as 60 Designs for Your New Home, 80 Designs, and other publications that were circulated by the Concrete Association of India included the work of architects who were leaving the Beaux-Arts system, who had been trained in the Beaux-Arts system, for instance, at Sir J.J. School here in Mumbai. But interestingly, these publications were, in a sense, the kind of first space for them to publish experiments with different kinds of modernism. And I'm using modernism very, very widely here. I'm using it to kind of encompass Art Deco, mid-century modernism that was coming out of the West Coast of the United States, European modernism, interwar modernism. So I don't think it's at all accidental in the sense that it's actually in concrete industry publications that the architects find their voice in relationship to a wider audience. And in the context of these publications, there's a kind of constant reminding to its readers, if it was read, that in a sense, cement is to be kind of managed by the architects. In a sense that the manuals these manuals such as 40 Designs for Low-Cost Houses, 60 Designs, 80 Designs, which, by the way, were actually reprinted for many decades. So not only did they have a kind of wide circulation in the kind of moment of their introduction in the mid-20th century, they continued to have an afterlife for many, many decades. But what's important to these publications is not just the kind of image, the home plan and perspectives and elevations that they would present, but also the kind of treatises on expertise. So for instance, in 80 Designs of Building for Every Purpose, it says at other times, a reliance on a mystery or a plan maker with rule of thumb experience in the crafts of building, or perhaps, in the latter case, lack of even that. Such methods may be shortcuts to initial economy, but only lead to trouble and vexation in the realization of unsatisfactory results and defects in the end. In these times, a mystery is in relation to a qualified architect is what a compounder is in relation to a qualified doctor. Viewed in this light, the difference is obvious. So in a sense, what we see here is the use of these publications to mark out a very clearly defined division of labor between the architect's expertise and that of the masonry or contractor and the worker. So you could also, at the same time, in other publications such as Modern Ideal Homes for India, are one of two of our, the engineer Deshpande's books. What's interesting in this context is that they besides kind of marking out like a very clear set of roles for the architect and the worker and the contractor, they also are a space in which to kind of translate designs which are coming from abroad. So R.S. Deshpande tells us he does a kind of journey, he goes around the world and he sees all of these kind of designs, he collects them and he brings them back. So for instance, this is Bruno Taut's contribution to the famous Weissenhof side building exhibition, which Le Corbusier and other architects participated in as well. It was a kind of seminal exhibition of modernist housing prior to World War II. And what he does is he kind of takes Bruno Taut's house and he basically moves the entrance and the bathroom, in a sense to kind of adhere loosely to kind of Octu principles. So I think what's interesting, even in the context of both this book made by an engineer or the books put out by the Concrete Association, you start to see also a kind of tweaking and translation of designs that are coming from the US and Europe at the time. A kind of adaptation to what they see as kind of local circumstances and contexts. These are images from a documentary about the Baksha Nangal Dam. And so another kind of useful form of evidence that I've been thinking about is advertisements. And advertisements put out by the Concrete Association of India and ACC at this time, in tracking them from, like, say, the late colonial period, 1930s and 40s, to the post-colonial period, you start to see also how a kind of geographic and kind of cultural imagination starts to change. And so in the 1930s, advertisements would show how cement substituted well for other materials. So for instance, in ACC advertisements and other cement advertisements in the Journal of Indian Institute of Architects, you'll find advertisements where, for instance, they'll show how cement will easily replace a timber beam. And what they'll do is they'll show, both in the Indian Concrete Journal and the Journal of Indian Institute of Architects, they'll show frequent examples of concrete architecture abroad, which is in a sense used merely to substitute older technologies. It's not used in a sense to create a kind of new heroic architecture, with some exceptions. Interestingly, after independence, which is what these advertisements were showing, the attention shifted to how cement would construct not only the infrastructure, but also the cultural and economic space of the nation. And so I found these actually very interesting, and these alongside many others, where these kind of uses of cement clearly oriented towards infrastructure, towards the dam, the road, and the cooling tower, were also associated with these almost like bas-reliefs of everyday life. And so in a sense, that cement was part of a kind of chain of consequences about the production of energy and its relationship to, for instance, agrarian economies and forms of life and so on. And so in a sense, cement is being kind of positioned here as creating a kind of infrastructure for the national economy and new forms of life that it was thought to support, in a sense, especially around the idea of a kind of economic form of citizenship, in a sense. This is an image from 80 Designs, and I think it's typical of what was shown in it. And so, a question I'd like to raise in looking back at some of these books is a question of how do you construct some of these images? You see in the context of even houses in Bangalore, these kind of distant reminiscences of many of the design cues that you find in these books, but radically transformed and accommodated. And so part of what I'm arguing here is that many of the designs that were being drafted up by architects in many of the Concrete Association booklets were in a sense designed with a different building economy in mind. They were designed with an economy that was in a sense imagined to involve a certain degree of mechanization and prefabrication of building elements. The reality on the ground at that moment, as is still the case in many parts of India, is that everything was constructed on site. And so I was interested in how, in the context of everyday construction in Bangalore, how making do and kind of actually taking these kind of radical images and adapting them itself became an important kind of labor, not only for workers and masonry and contractors, but also for architects. I think in the context of Bangalore, and I think Bangalore is in some ways typical of cities that were not the presidency cities like Mumbai or Chennai, but that in a sense in Bangalore at this moment, there's only a handful of architects who are actually practicing in the city. There are architects such as, for instance, Kamal Iyer, who, as you know, practices here still in Bombay, who were working in Bangalore. same with architects from Chennai who were working in the city, but in large part, there was only a handful of architects in the city. In addition to that, the Architects Bill was passed in 1972 to great fanfare, but it really had no great consequences, I think, on the ground at that moment, and I think took time to actually have any kind of impact. At the same time, the Visvesvaraya Engineering College was only founded in 1916, and this is an image of one of the first classes at Visvesvaraya Engineering College, which includes V.R. Manikam, who was the state architect for Karnataka for many years. But Bangalore University's architecture program was inaugurated only in 1968. So in a sense, what happened in the context of Bangalore is that many who wanted to do architecture either had to leave the city, or in most cases went into engineering. In addition to that, still in the context of Bangalore, you'll find many contractors who call themselves engineers but actually do not have a degree. Or you find contractors who slowly kind of made their way up the ranks to a certain degree of expertise as engineers and took on their role. And in a sense, at this time in the context of building in Bangalore, they also, in a sense, assume the role that architects otherwise would have played. And so part of my argument here is that a lot of this kind of mobility between expert and supposedly inexpert forms of labor was, in a sense, enabled by the ease of use of cement and concrete and these kind of technologies. That if this was a context where, for instance, highly complex technical assemblies, which would then require a very kind of rigid distribution of expertise, that it wouldn't, in a sense, have allowed for these other kind of practices and this kind of porosity between the expert and the inexpert to actually kind of puncture each other in a sense. And so cement, in a sense, accommodated a kind of heterogeneous array of expertise. So for instance, many of these drawings and designs were done by civil engineers who were working in the Public Works Department, but were then given over to a contractor. I mean, normally there was a kind of personal relationship between a contractor and someone in the Public Works Department. And interestingly, what they would do is they'd basically give it over to the contractor, and the contractor would do whatever they pleased with it, which probably sounds familiar as a point of frustration to us today. But in a sense, the contractor started to kind of emerge with cement. The contractor emerged with a kind of acceleration of construction, even on a kind of everyday level in the city, and it emerged with new technologies, I would argue, such as cement. And so the kind of idea of the cement house here was, in a sense, drawn by one person, but actually taken up by another who had never had access to or entered the kind of the space of the university like all of us sit in now. And so here's an example of a house that was made by a woman in Jayanagar in the early 1960s, who actually started out in engineering college, but then was forced to marry by her family. And so what she ended up doing was basically operating as an architect in First Block in Jayanagar, and giving advice to many neighbors, doing designs for them, working with contractors. And so I think what's important about architecture in this period in Bangalore and the kind of people that were making it, and why a material like cement matters, is that it allowed this kind of democratization of building. It allowed for actors such as this person to actually access design and access the kind of work of design, not just the kind of work of menial labor, say for instance moving something here and there, but really taking up what they see as here as a kind of modern design. And I don't think all of this is necessarily, we think of cement as a kind of emblem of unskilled labor, but there's actually a certain amount of precision that's built into these kind of projects. And so why I title this talk The Urbanism of Plaster is because this kind of combination of contracting, cement, And as I'll talk about here, things like the cinema hall and the hotel, it created a kind of, not only a kind of democratization of building, but a circulation of ideas about architecture. That if we think back to, for instance, even kind of earlier moments in history, even in the early 20th century, I think, for instance, of Kerala and some of the anti-Brown movements that were going on, and this kind of unsettledness about the relationship, for instance, of caste to different work that would happen on site. Those kind of hierarchies and divisions of labor don't go away, per se. But I think what I found in the context of Bangalore is that there is a certain kind of mobility that actually happens in the 20th century, especially as kind of new materials are introduced. This is an image of Tribhuvan Cinema, which was built in 1973 by architect Govinda Rao from Chennai. Sadly, it was demolished 6 months ago. A really incredible building. But I think what's interesting here is the importance of surface. So when we think back to, say, for instance, this house, and the fact that here, even in the context of a house like this, the design is, the kind of plan and layout of the house is actually very banal. Ostensibly, you'd see many of the same layout, the arrangement of windows and doors around the neighborhood, but where you actually start to see difference and where you start to see not only difference, but the design in a certain sense happen. A kind of, enthusiasm for both kind of aesthetics and technology, you see it in the surface. And so my argument here is that actually this is also because of cinema halls and hotels in the city. Cinema halls and hotels, meaning eateries in the city, were the kind of first spaces for both the kind of use of new technologies like cement, but also the use of cement alongside other older technologies, such as plaster of Paris. So again, this kind of relationship between the skilled and the unskilled. So again, this is Tribhuvan Cinema. The exterior also takes on this kind of dynamic quality of geometry on the surface that kind of peels off of the facade. But as you kind of walk through the cinema hall, you actually start to see that there's also this kind of proliferation of very kind of rich materialities, things that are shiny, stones, things that are kind of incised into. Also here, a kind of motif that runs throughout the cinema hall of lips, because Tribhuvan means is the myth of kind of three worlds being born on Krishna's tongue. And so, in a sense, this kind of richness of surface is something that actually gets introduced through new spaces of public life in the city. And this is important because this is a moment in Bangalore's history where the division between North Bangalore, the cantonment, and the city was starting to kind of relax. And spaces like the cinema hall and the hotel were also spaces of mixing, of kind of social miscegenation, where different castes and classes would meet each other, which Janaki Nair and others have recounted in the context of the city. So they have an important role in the kind of social history of the city, but they also introduce new materialities, new intense colors and geometric patterns, things that really had not been part of the landscape of the city before they were built. And so my argument is that they, in a sense, were the cinema hall and the hotel were a kind of space from which all of these kind of new, not only motifs and images of design, but also techniques proliferated. So here's an example of another shape that actually was adapted from cinema halls. It was adapted from the armrest on cinema hall chairs. This is the chevron. And the chevron, in a sense, was translated to jollies, which are pictured here. And so what's interesting is that they, in a sense, the shape of the chevron, which was used in the armrest of the cinema hall, actually had to change to accommodate the reproduction as used in the jolly. So much as what I showed earlier, where the kind of deep relief work of gare and hydraulic lime plasters and mortars, much as that collapsed and flattened, to accommodate cement. Here, the chevron as a kind of ornament and a pattern, something that you would actually feel in your hands, was also the kind of shape and contours of that changed as it was translated to another medium. Say from metal to a cement jolly. So the shape itself proliferated widely and continues to in the city, especially in plebeian constructions in contemporary Bangalore. Here's another image from Vivipuram in the 1970s. But in a sense, these patterns kind of leapt onto the surfaces of the city at a certain moment. Again, here, very flat and simple geometries, but nonetheless kind of pervasive in the city, which at a later point, this constructed much later, probably the 1990s or 2000s, where the chevron here is kind of made into a kind of structural motif. But what I wanted to think about is these translations from the armchair, something that would be carved into wood or embossed into metal, to the jolly, and then to something which can be done easily by hand. These kind of shapes wouldn't require a lot of expertise. They wouldn't require a lot of skill. And so as they kind of circulate over time, they also transform. And they have to kind of meet the demands of less skilled construction labor and quickening construction. Here's another example of a cinema hall that was designed by Razi Mohammed. By Razi Mohammed in 1960 near Yelahanka in Bangalore. And what you see here are these basically crosses. And these crosses, in a sense, draw from the dingbat. The dingbat is a common ornament actually in Hollywood, in Los Angeles, which when I lived in Los Angeles, I saw every day leaving my apartment. But this is a kind of ornament that's used and has many different materialities in different metals, even in cement, in the context of Los Angeles. But it has a kind of strong association with Hollywood at this moment, in the 1950s and 60s. And so the architect here has actually taken that motif and kind of translated it to the facade of the cinema hall. And what's interesting to me is that what you also start to see is that this motif then starts to kind of circulate around even kind of everyday walls as they're constructed in the city. But what happens when the kind of context of skill and time change? Like here, clearly the ornament has itself, in its shape, changed to kind of adapt to clearly a kind of demand for quickness and probably something that's undertaken by less skilled labor and perhaps even a different level of investment than this would have required. And so I think, in thinking about this, I want to think about beyond the kind of visual qualities of things, but also like how these questions of skill and this kind of traffic between the architect's work and the work of kind of unskilled labor, how this kind of unfolds. And I think you also see this in other ornaments. You see this with the diamond, which is translated in many different ways. Here, potentially to kind of evoke the kind of veins of stone. Here carved into wood in a door. Here again in cement on a sit-out in front of a jugli in front of an older house in Ulthor. But what's interesting is how these things kind of change and evolve in relationship to the kind of materials that they're made out of and the kinds of expertise that would be required to work with wood versus with cement or with paint. And in a sense, I'm arguing that cement was not just a kind of isolated medium in this context, that it actually, it was necessarily involved with wood, paint, and other materialities. Like those of the cinema hall, for instance, like plaster of Paris, metal, and so on. But in a sense, because cement was easy to use, it also, it allowed newly urban publics, both in the sense of patrons and in the sense of workers, to actually start to kind of imagine for themselves what these kind of new modern architectures might mean in a kind of wider context in Bangalore. And like one of the issues I want to conclude on is just that I've always been interested in why we don't talk about the cinema hall that much in talking about the history of architecture. There is, of course, a lot published about cinema halls, especially in the context of Bombay in the 20th century. But I actually think that they are kind of important spaces, not only for the work of the architect, but the relationship of the architect's work to the kind of landscape of cities like Bangalore. And in kind of looking at cinema halls, we find, when we look at cinema halls and we also look at this kind of circulation of ornaments and even materialities around the context of a city like Bangalore in the 1950s and 60s, we find practices that really challenge these kind of distinctions of between vernacular artisanal labor and the work of the kind of professional architects and the kind of work we do, the kind of way we think about design. I think we find actors that don't quite fit either, even in the case of architects. And so these are practices that I'm interested in thinking about, and would like to think about also in the context of their kind of involvement with new technologies, because I think that in tracking the proliferation of, say, cement in the context of Bangalore, we also start to see a kind of web of connections between these different actors, rather than a kind of siloed off distinctions between them. And so I think with that, I'll conclude, and we can maybe open it up for discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Curt. That was, I really enjoyed your talk. Just to kind of, until the audience warms up, I have a kind of simple question in the head. You kept on using the word design in your talk, and I was just confused that what were you really referring to? Were you referring to the decorations, or what were you kind of implying by the use of the word design in your
Well, I guess I'm just trying to I'm trying to loosen it from its affiliation with the work of the architect. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think that these kind of hard and fast distinctions between technical labor and what we think of as artistic labor, between work and art, are actually not so indistinct. Even in the work of architects, I would say. Even as somebody who was recently teaching architecture, I don't think, even in the context of contemporary design pedagogy, that these kind of distinctions actually hold water in many cases, even though there are differences. I think what's interesting to me in looking at the kind of circulation of ornaments and the kind of techniques that involved, I think it really asks us to expand what we think of as being as design. So I don't know does that answer your question?
Yeah.
You don't have to, you can also disagree.
No, I think you were using the word design in a very semantically different way to refer to when you talk about design in plaster, what do you intend to mean? You mean to refer to the superficial ornamentation, or you mean something much more spatial?
In this context, I'm talking about surface. Yeah.
So very interesting to talk about you map the history of concrete with the history of the cinema hall, very interestingly. I'm just thinking that there's also, for example, the apartment block is also something that comes up with the history of concrete, right? And you talked about this kind of, the way craft comes in, right? Like this kind of carry forward of earlier forms of craftsmanship that kind of come in with this use of concrete and plaster. But it's also interesting to look at how, for example, caste gets mapped down. For example, the apartment block, which was considered this idea of modernity, in cases like we recently found in IIT Chennai, the apartment block built of concrete, built in the 70s, which is sort of in IIT Chennai, which is like this kind of the seat of modernity, so to say, right? And the seat of secularism. You suddenly find the apartment block having 3 staircases.
Wow.
Okay? And so it's like these concrete staircases that come up to every floor. There's one staircase, of course, for the residents, one staircase coming up to the kitchen, and one staircase actually coming up to the toilet blocks. And that's the staircase that is for the cleaners to clean. So it's kind of interesting, this whole question of modernity and this idea of being progressive somehow kind of, gets, it's a little fuzzy in that sense.
Yeah, no, I think also even in the context of construction, I mean, this is something I'm also, now that this is, by the way, this is an ongoing project. I mean, it's a project I've been working on for a long time, but it's also work that I'm returning to. And one of the questions I have is the question of caste and who was actually handling different materials and levels of skill at that time. My sense was that it was in some ways more mobile than actually I expected at that time in Bangalore specifically, but but I think it's a question. Because as we know, even a lot of the kind of agriculturalists who come and serve as contractors, like the 90s or whatever, it's always it is a particular casting community that ends up taking on those roles in the context of Bangalore, and that is important to account for because they are entering into. I mean, these are questions of power in the city, and in terms of who's building the city. And then ultimately in contemporary Bangalore, how that's translated into real estate, because contractors then get into real estate and so on. So anyway, did you?
Somewhat in continuation of what Shupali has asked, in Bombay, in Bombay in the 1920s and 30s, there were these quarters made for the labor, in the BDD charge, the Bombay Development Directorate, and but actually the main intention was to experiment with the concrete blocks, the structural potentials and so on, and less importance was given to the fact that they are living quarters of the working class families. So there were windows without any grills, and then later on they were added because the workers demanded. So, and maybe 200, 300 buildings were constructed in the concrete block. So again, the intention was not to create housing. The basic thing was to experiment with the structural qualities. They were all made with concrete blocks.
When was this again?
The first time. I mean, these concrete blocks were used for the first time in the city.
When was this again? What year was this?
1920s.
This is the 20s. Okay, interesting. So that early, yeah. And that's interesting because that's also an alternative history to because normally when people talk about concrete in the context of Bombay, they talk about the Back Bay recommendation. They talk about Marine Drive and this. Its role not only in the context of Bombay, but also in producing new images of concrete architecture that were disseminated throughout India at that time. But you're actually saying, but I think this is there's other histories too.
What you are focusing on is the materiality of plaster and, aesthetics coming out.
Right.
This was purely structural. They didn't even consider the function. So there were no provision of water supply. There was no provision of proper sanitation. So it was mainly to construct how we 3 floors, 4 floors, building blocks with concrete blocks.
Well, I think in some ways it makes sense because the industry was concentrated in Bombay. All of that capital was here. When you see examples of experiments with concrete and cement, it's here, So for instance, what I didn't mention in the presentation, there was a concrete school in Bombay that the Concrete Association of India set up to basically train, it was more to train unskilled labor, I think, is the sense I get. Not like they didn't have architects sitting out there like fumbling with the but you know, just to train unskilled or labor and contractors in how to use concrete, for instance. And so there was these kind of, and that's something I've actually been wanting to learn more about. I've heard about it, but there's no great documentation on it. But there was these, especially in the context of Bombay, these kinds of experiments. You know, whatever the consequences, obviously in this context, you know, its relationship to labor sounds, you know, a bit nefarious, or just, you know, ill-advised. But it's interesting. Yeah, and I think, well, and also I was just thinking more about Manoj's question. You know, I think there's that, like I am making an argument about like paying attention to surface and small details in a way. Because my sense is that both in India, and I think when I think of histories of concrete and architectural production, even recently, so for instance, Adrian Forty's book about concrete, and you know, there is a chapter about labor, but otherwise it you know, he's the first one to actually draw attention to how it's used, actually. Otherwise, for much literature in the 20th century, even when they would entertain, like for instance, Peter Collins' book called Concrete, which is very straightforward. It starts off with this really fascinating history of how he argues that concrete emerges from mud in the context of France. And it's this very dry technical history, which, as you can imagine, for somebody like me is exciting. but then goes into how that advanced into the work of a French architect and the creation of new forms of space. So concrete is often, especially in modernist literature, associated with, like for instance, Siegfried Giedion was associated with what he called a new space conception. So I think I'm actually trying to do something different, which is to say, like I'm actually interested in these. I'm interested in surface and these kind of smaller experience, like literally smaller scale experiences, because they involve other kinds of, they involve other actors, they involve other histories that are not histories of rationalization or mechanization, nor of technological failure. I mean, I think what they show is that cement actually created the conditions for you know, an incredibly open domain of proliferations of designs, which move between the architect's work and all these other actors. So, yeah.
Yeah, actually, I was also thinking about how plaster introduces a kind of a new kind of smoothness to the entire texture of the city, and how that smoothness also then kind of goes on to take on, it is a kind of smoothness which can take on color also, which probably earlier wasn't possible in the older kind of methods of plastering. So how the city also starts becoming more and more colorful and more profusion. There's a kind of extreme profusion of colors, and then this fascination with the smooth is actually kind of keeping on going further with the use of glass and kind of making the surfaces more and more uninterrupted.
Well, I think smoothness is an aspiration to you know, even mechanical industrial construction, actually. I mean, I think you don't find, in the context of Bangalore at this moment, you don't find people making things that look rural, that look like the architecture either of the ancestral home, for those who had ancestral homes made out of stones and you know, older lime plasters and things like this, and kind of wood columns, or of kind of mud and clay and other materialities. Like, you don't see anyone mimicking that. It's a very deliberate effort to actually mimic things that are smooth, right, and modern in a sense. Yeah, and I think paint also. I didn't mention this, but colored paint comes into the picture only in the 1970s in Bangalore, into white use. So, color paint in some of these examples I've showed is also a way to create difference within homogeneity, to basically call out certain shapes, to let things kind of pop out in a way that they would otherwise disappear, right? Especially when you're talking about these very, very shallow forms of ornament. So I think it's, and to kind of follow, to return to an argument I was making just about the fact that I actually see all these materials as very interdependent at a certain moment. I mean, I think chemical colored paint and cement are actually very reliant on each other in this context, because in order to kind of create this kind of wild forms of geometry and coloration, for things to actually stand out and be differentiated, you can't just do that in cement. What preceded colored paint was a lime-based wash that was like a yellowish wash. And so, I think it's important that at a moment when many people are building their first house in Bangalore, many of whom grew up in small towns in southern Karnataka or Tamil Nadu, that these things are important in the sense of also creating difference against the kind of landscape of houses that are being constructed. So also because these are, whether they're single family or nuclear family homes, these are very different living conditions. All of the families that I interviewed who had built houses in this time were living in joint family compounds, which they describe as leaky and falling apart and all these things. And so these houses were certainly a kind of marked departure on so many levels for them.
Okay, so I looked at that slide where you had shown a very well-crafted plaster piece, and there was another one which was...
Which one?
So you made the distinction of the labor, where you said that these are people who had agricultural background, while the others were probably craftsmen.
Ah, yeah.
Right?
Okay. You're talking about...
Yep. You showed this one and then you showed the other one.
Yeah.
So, are you saying that this is a job of people who were basically involved in cultivation, who came in as labor and started kind of working with this plaster, while the other one is a community of, or a group of people who've been skilled to do a certain kind of craft? So does that come? So what was their leading? In the sense that were they earlier stone craftsmen, or so there is obviously a transformation, because plaster being what it is, there is obviously some traditional knowledge or skill or sense of proportion that comes with you. And so that is one of the questions, that who were the other guys? I mean, this I have understood what you said. But these craftsmen who were using this very ornate, or making these very ornate plaster motifs, who were they and what has happened to them? Are they different? Number one. And number two, one of the most, I think, where plaster is very extensively used and crafted are the temples, even today.
Right, yeah.
And I'm just wondering, why did you leave that out? I mean, were you just focusing on contemporary buildings? Because that's also modern. I mean, that's the new Indian modern, so to say, right?
Yeah.
And if at all there is any building that completely seeks its expression through plaster, it's the temple.
Right.
Much of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could construct a similar history of temple design and architecture. I mean, I think maybe I didn't look at temples in this period because my sense was that they involved, from the get-go, like a higher level of craft and expertise. Whereas in housing, you actually start to see all these other practices, people who were just kind of like learning, learning on site, who had no background in craft prior, who were coming into the picture and producing things that were not, were skilled but not highly skilled. Whereas when I think of temple architecture in Bangalore at the time, it's pretty sophisticated in a sense. Now, over time, we know that, like, for instance, in especially like a lot of contemporary smaller temples, roadside constructions, that's a very different story in terms of the kind of actors that are involved in those things. So I actually don't have as good a sense of that history. My friend Annapurna Gaudamela has been working on this in the context of Bangalore. I suppose I was interested in, the house because of its, the project up till this point has largely been about houses, actually. I think because of its strong associations with durability, and these kind of ideas about durability. But it's a good question. It's a good question because I actually think, to the first question, I think it's something I have to spend more time with in the sense of, obviously the people who are working on this are also working on, I'm sure they're working on temples, right? So at the time. So unfortunately, no one that I interviewed actually worked in this material. The people that I was interviewing remembered it because they were younger and they remembered seeing it and working with people who were skilled in it. But in a sense, it's not. It's a question. It's a good one. Who were they? I mean, clearly, my understanding, based on interviews and speaking with other engineers who looked at this history, is that they, galley workers who worked on this material and this kind of work, did that kind of work. I mean, they weren't working in other materials per se. They weren't doing stonework or carpentry, for instance. But I think that's a question too, because that's an assumption people make. And I think it's one to also be questioned historically. Is there any traffic, right, between, for instance, carpenters who are working in wood? I mean, I think it deserves to be said that, woodwork is not a big, in southern Karnataka, highly skilled carpentry is not, it's just not as prevalent as you would find on the, in coastal Karnataka, for instance. So there are those kind of regional distinctions too. In terms of where skilled labor happens, I think. Stone, on the other hand, would be different. Even in the construction of Vidhan Sada, which involved a lot of highly skilled stone workers, actually.
Hi, I have two questions. The first one is regarding, can you hear me?
Yeah, just speak a little bit. Thanks.
So I have two questions. The first one is regarding the slide where you mentioned when concrete was introduced, cement was introduced as a building material. The time when the cement was introduced as a building material, bodily experience and experimentation moved from the site to the factory. Okay, what one sees in cities such as Mumbai and possibly Bangalore is the movement from the factory to the site. There are many things that happen in between, particularly places where or neighborhoods where this material is stored. And for instance, a lot of go-downs largely are there in informal settlements.
Right.
And
yeah. Right.
do these places then become the laboratories for experimentation and for the bodily experience?
That's a really good
question. The second question is, you pose the typology of the cinema hall as a site of experimentation for the urbanism of plaster. And I'm just wondering that, are there other sites, for instance, if you kind of rethink Mike Davis's idea of shadow cities, like around Mumbai, on the periphery of Mumbai, you have several of these townships which are actually experimentations of plaster and cement, and which have a relevance in terms of the legal debate itself. Because
Which have a relevance in terms of what? I'm
in
sorry.
terms of the debate on legality
Okay.
and expertise.
Yes.
Recently in Mumbai, over the last 4 years, a lot of numerous buildings have fallen down, which were supposedly unauthorized and not built by architects, but which were experimentations in cement and concrete. And so a whole lot of settlements proliferate in cities such as Mumbai. So is there a possibility to think through these as sites of experimentation beyond the cinema hall itself?
Beyond the cinema hall. And what you're talking about is, these are settlements within the last, what, 10 years, 20 years? No.
50 years?
Okay. So you're talking about that time period as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
both old and new.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that's actually a really good question, because I think what you're pointing to is that there's a lot that happens on those lines, even when you zoom in. There's a lot of transactions, and I remember seeing, for instance, a wall in Bangalore that somebody constructed out of cement bags. They had just thrown water on it, and just piled them. Which is that experimentation? I don't know, but it's just to say that, like, what happens in those zones of proximity is a good question. I don't know if I have an answer to that, actually. I think it's something I'm actually looking at more now, which is how to actually, something I'm interested in doing, like, maybe more rigorously now, and maybe in a more contemporary sense, is actually really tracking how things move and where they go, and what happens when they go there. Because in this context, this is a very particular history, also of the kind of culture of the street, and the space of the street is a space in which that's kind of porous to the cinema hall and the eatery and all these things. It's a kind of particular cultural history at a particular moment, actually, that has passed in Bangalore. I don't think you'll find, interestingly, you'll find a lot of these ornaments that were in wide circulation in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, now being used in slums in the city. But so they actually have this kind of, they have a kind of lifespan over a longer duration that's actually worth thinking about, I think, in terms of its politics. Even in terms of its not just caste politics, but also its class politics. Yeah, I think is the cinema hall the only space? No, I don't think so. I think it's a good question, though. Like, what are the other? I don't think I have an answer to that, but I think I'd have to think more about it. But I think it's actually a really good question for us to think about, which is whether new technologies come into, and I think this is interesting to think about even in the context of contemporary India. Like, when we think about, like, what are new technologies today? Where do they actually come into use first? And how do they actually disseminate? Or rather, do they actually become involved in different contexts, kind of simultaneously? I would say probably the latter. I think this idea that new technologies start in one place and then fan out is actually not ever really the case. Like, it's much more complicated. And so what I think it requires is to kind of follow the material in a sense, and see it as a network, actually, of different spaces and actors, even rural and urban, not just within cities. So it'd be interesting to think about, like, what is that today? Like, what would be examples of that today? Like, for instance, aluminum cladding and things, these things start somewhere. And I think that somewhere matters, actually.
Hello, my name is Akshay. Why it is like it's always for you? I mean, why it is like in cement? Why are you just talking about cement? The embroidery part when we saw, there was an embroidery done in a stone. Then you compared that stone, the material of the stone, to cement. Of course, you're talking about the technological change from, like, you're mainly talking about the technological change when the cement came into existence. But while changing the embroidery part, the limitations of embroidery in stones and the embroidery in cement, I guess the material has changed, the feel has changed. If you are talking about the material, the embroidery in cement, it was very different. You're talking about the embroidery which has a limitation in cement and which had a same limitation in stone. So why don't you keep it distinct? I mean, why are you including the stone embroidery into the cement embroidery? I mean, they are different as a material. Why we are comparing at this moment?
Well, because I would say that concrete was this kind of medium that allowed for reproducibility, and so I think what I found in the context of Bangalore is that the things that are made in cement also become made in wood and stone, and then back in cement. You see what I'm saying? So I think it's interesting for me to think of, I think, and why that matters at that moment is because cement of those materials, cement involves the least amount of expertise. I mean, it's the medium that actually opens up the imagination of all these designs to actors who are not highly skilled and not expert. So in a sense, that's why I kind of put cement, place it centrally in a way. But I think the point is that there's a lot of traffic between these different materials. You know what I'm saying? Like I don't think you can separate them. I mean, all that, a lot of what was going on in the interior of cinema halls was in stone and plaster of Paris. Plaster of Paris involved, in the context of Bangalore, generally it was artisans from Rajasthan who were highly skilled who would come and do that work. But then the interesting thing is to see how that's then translated as people copy that. And then how that transforms. And then how another person copies that.
But the story of copying from stone to cement changes the whole feeling, the whole emotion. A thing carved in a stone, a thing carved or made in cement gives out a very different kind of feel.
But what do you mean a different kind of feel? I mean, I agree, yes. I mean, they're very different.
It does. Yeah. So, I personally don't think so that making a comparison between the materials such as cement and stone and carvings between them is something does not fit into my mind. Like, should I think about the cement as a and you're talking about the unskilled working with cement is they can create this embroidery without any skill. But why? I mean, there is a skill, there is a material, there is embroidery, and this whole three things make a person, architecture, a structure. When a third party goes there and watches it, gives out a different emotion to them. So why don't we keep it distinct rather including into the cement?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I do. I think it's worth thinking about historically. I wouldn't assume that they give a different emotion in the sense that you're saying. Like, I think what's interesting is that different materials, I think they do. I mean, different materials have different connotations, right? There's a reason people stop using stone. I think a lot of that's economic at this moment, but it's also because of what it signifies, right? Concrete is modern, stone is not. I mean, that's a kind of gross oversimplification, but just for the purposes of conversation, I think that's more or less true at that moment. But I think it's important, but I would like to say that I think it's important to see how materials actually mimic each other in moments like this, right? Because the thing is that it gives a very different idea of what history looks like. Like new technologies replacing the old. what I'm trying to say is that, well, yeah, that's not necessarily the case. New technologies sometimes are actually made to look old. I mean, in the context of contemporary Bangalore, there's a lot of architects who at some point in the late 90s, early 2000s started making walls in cement plaster to look like mud. So, and it leaves you somewhat confused. Is it mud? Is it cement? Clearly, it's meant to look like mud. I mean, these are kind of slippages that, they're important to think about. Because, for instance, in that context, in contemporary Bangalore, architecture that looks like mud but is not mud is being used in the context of new middle and upper middle class housing on the outskirts of the city, and especially a lot of people who are coming back from abroad, who are thinking back to the ancestral home, which many of them have never lived in, and actually want to kind of reconnect with that somehow. I mean, I noticed this when I first started doing field work and saw this again and again. So these things have, they're also historical. Like they have, I wouldn't say that there's a kind of timeless relationship to stone, right? Stone means something at this moment that would be quite different than what it means in contemporary Bangalore. So anyway, I'll stop there. But I guess I just like to say that, I think materials are also used to look like each other in this context. And why that is important is because it's also, this is a kind of, sometimes that's not always deliberate. I mean, sometimes it's also because people just that's what they have on hand. And I think that's an important kind of work to think about. Because it's not like everyone always sits around and says, oh, well, how is someone going to interpret this, right? Like, it's also like, what do I have? And what do I want it to look like? And in some ways, the way I'm using cement is cement itself is irrelevant. It's actually a certain way of thinking about how you make a surface, how you make ornament, what architecture looks like. What you make it in, at least for a number of decades, it didn't necessarily matter. So I think that's interesting to think about.
Hi, I had a question. So what you were talking about is more of the surface treatment using plaster. So if you look at the modern architecture which is happening even in India, there's more emphasis on the materiality of the surface. So that it's more of exposed concrete or exposed brickwork. And if you look at it now, if you look at a building which is properly done in concrete, plaster is the worst thing that you could do to the wall. Plaster is looked at as if it's a mistake repairing sort of a thing in today's terms. So all these ornamentations that you showed us, it's kind of a dying artwork. So if you look at Jaisalmer right now, all the renovations of the castles, all the ornamentations are actually done in concrete. It's because the artists who could carve the stones, they're very less right now, and it becomes very costly to do. So with the modernism sort of taking over the urban areas, people tend to go more and more towards exposed concrete rather than doing a plaster work.
Is it exposed though, or is it, are they painting it? I'm just curious, like in Jaisalmer, like in the context you're thinking.
Yeah, they're painting it yellow to look as if it's Jaisalmer stone, but it's actually concrete.
But
that's in terms of a historical place like Jaisalmer. But if you look at more urban areas like Bombay, nowadays if you look at any new building that's been built, you'll hardly see any ornamentation done on that. So it's more of a smooth surface, which is kind of, which gives you the look of urban than the artistic.
I think the same in Bangalore. I mean, that's why I said you find this kind of ornament in the context of slums, but you don't find it actually in a lot of new housing. Whether it's done by, definitely not in the work of architects. Architects would, I don't know. You'd never catch an architect dead in contemporary Bangalore doing this kind of stuff.
Is an architect actually doing that sort of thing in today's day?
No. So but you'd also, but also even in the work of contractors. It's just, I think, there's many reasons for that, right? A lot of this is, in the context of Bangalore, the ideal of the suburban the ideal of a suburban American home, for instance, right? You can't ignore it. I mean, it's there everywhere in the city. And it has a huge impact on the way in which people think about the role that the front elevation of a house plays. In this context, everything happens in the in that elevation. Whereas, and I think even over the last few decades in Bangalore, when you start, especially with especially upper class housing in the city, in neighborhoods like Koramangala first, and then other neighborhoods after that, you start to see houses and compounds that actually don't have to speak to the street in this way. I think that is a big change that happens, and it places less pressure on this one surface, on this very thin surface, right? It distributes investment in materials, in finishing, to the entirety of the home in different ways. But I don't think that's the case for every kind of housing in Bangalore, right? I mean, when I'm talking about this, I'm imagining like very elite housing in the city. But I'm also imagining that, for instance, based on my experience, like how these kind of new single-family houses in Bangalore also then start to become flattened. I mean, I've seen this happen in the context of buildings with multiple units, or even apartment buildings, where, for instance, the tile roof becomes collapsed into just a small kind of window shade or something like this, like no more than this big, right? But I mean, in a sense, that's a way of invoking the kind of tile roof, but collapsing it into something that's almost more like a surface, but not in the way of these ornaments, right? I think those are of a different time in a way, and their association with upwardly mobile architecture in the city is no longer for the upwardly mobile who occupy the more elite classes of the city. For the subaltern, for subaltern classes and populations in the city, I think that's actually a different case. So I mean, you still see these things being made.
Don't you think that since the cement work made, the carving and the decoration and all of that had a royalty in it because only skilled craftsmen could do it? But after the intervention of cement, or invention, whatever you call it, it became so generalized that, I'm just adding on to his point, that due to which it died. Like, it could be done so easily that then they started preferring plain surface over like ornamentation because it could be done easily. So it lost its royalty, which it had before.
What was I couldn't hear the last thing you said because of the kids.
It lost. It was first an outstanding work, like only some skilled craftsmen could do it. But now it like got so generalized that it lost its exclusiveness. And
It got so generalized that what?
exclusiveness, which it had before.
The replicability that the government allows makes it as
Yeah.
Due to which the art died.
No, I'm just thinking about it. Because I think at this moment there is an exclusivity attached to it, actually. Because something I find really striking about this moment is that in the production of new concrete architecture, that there's a total rejection of even what architects are drawing in a lot of these concrete publications, which actually communicate a kind of austerity of surface, meaning like smooth, relatively unadorned surfaces, right? So I think why I was drawn to a lot of this in the first place was because it actually looked very different than what architects were communicating in terms of what a house would and should look like. It involved, a certain amount of reproducibility, but I don't think that devalued it at that moment. But it is a question: at what point does it At what point is reproducibility valued or not? You know, so it's an interesting question.
No, I like your presentation very much. Thanks. And my favorite slide was that the compounder, doctor, and the architect and the Mestri slide. And I think that was important for all of us to note as students of architecture, was because, I mean, it kind of, it does 2 or 3 things. One is it kind of, sets up the hierarchy in the business of building buildings. But also the way you tied up the history of cement and concrete to the history of practice of architecture. And the role that ACC, not only through its institutions, but also through its publications, played in the shaping of the practice. And that kind of, clarifies a lot as to why today in architectural education, concrete dominates, So it is a nice kind of, for me, it was also a history of the practice of architecture, along with the kind of history of cement and concrete. My question is, were there any kind of responses which took an opposite position to the proliferation of this kind of practice? Were there deliberate responses or even reactions to what was happening at general? I mean, were there people who were kind of uncomfortable with the proliferation of concrete and cement, like there are now? But were there at that time? Is there a history to that? Is there a kind of is there in your own kind of research? Did you see any publications or anything like that? Because otherwise, it's a general story of it's a broad story without any instance of
friction.
Friction.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So,
Well,
I mean, it's not possible.
Well, which is not possible, yeah. I mean, I think for that, I will have to look more also in the context of architectural discourse, but I think like even in the context, there's the example of Shantiniketan and the revival of this kind of Gandhian form of construction, which didn't just happen with Laurie Baker. There was also all these experiments with soil block construction, but soil block construction also was not being presented as a counter or something against concrete per se. It was actually being experimented with because it was supposedly lower cost. It didn't. I don't think it carried the same kind of like even Otto Königsberger in the context of. Bhubaneswar, no, I'm so tired, I'm forgetting the steel town in, thank you, Jamshedpur, yes. In the context of experiments he was doing in Jamshedpur was also proposing that we would do soil block construction, which is not mud, but, still the effort there is to draw from a kind of, a different economy than that map I was showing of the cement, the network of cement. I don't think you have like in the context of Bangalore, I don't think that you see a response to concrete architecture. I do think you see a response I don't think you see a response to concrete. I think you see a response to what's done with it. So I didn't get in, I didn't quote this, but there was in the article that I'm writing, I know some of you know Solly Benjamin. His father was, a very elite government architect and came on a mission to Bangalore to evaluate its urban conditions. And I found this sitting in the town planning library, in this like pile somewhere in the back. And it was this like really astounding little document about how horrified they were with what they described as the kind of congestion and loudness of the city. I mean, it was a kind of classic narrative of, you know, the architect and planner being aghast at what has become of the modern city, the sense of it being in decline. But I think for me, it was actually interesting to see them. This is the late 70s, I think. So it was interesting for me to see that, because that was one example of an architect spending time in Bangalore and actually expressing, expressing clear discontent towards what they saw as a kind of new architecture of urban proliferation, meaning whatever you want to call it. I mean, encroachments, but also signage. I mean, if you kind of like read through their text and then imagine what they're saying, you know, it's not hard to imagine signage, color, noise. And so in a sense, like I see some of the work I've shown today as also being part of that that culture in a way. So I think that's why the cinema hall is interesting to me, because that's actually a space where you do find the architect. And you do find the architect actually engaging a kind of urban condition in Bangalore at the time, which in some ways was quite radical. It was very, very different. I mean, you wouldn't, when they started building some of the cinema halls I showed, there was not a lot of ornament of that kind in the city, for instance. But you know, I think it's interesting to think about the cinema hall as a space and a kind of a form of architecture that architects were undertaking that was not that you couldn't categorize as this kind of like position of disgust at what had become of the promise of the city. Because there's a lot of debate in Bangalore. I mean, even Janaki Nair in her book about Bangalore, I mean, it's called The Promise of the Metropolis, you know. And I think she titled it that because there was this like very strong sense that the city was in decline. I mean, obviously there's a whole discourse about that in the context of Bombay as well. So, you know, I guess the point here is to say, how do you see this kind of, even this like minor work and surface as emblematic of a kind of urban like conditions of possibility for what the city might look like, rather than a kind of indication of decline. So, in a sense, that's why it was interesting for me to see Mr. Benjamin and others, and they're you know, I mean, it wasn't surprising to me to see that they were their reaction to what had happened in Bangalore. It's also interesting because, you know, in the context of contemporary Bangalore, people, as everyone knows, it's like, you know, everyone loves to talk about how terrible Bangalore is now, and and it's really fascinating when you actually go back to even the 50s and 60s, and you already see in all of these like small publications that were being put out by architects and planners in the city, where they'd have like a very neatly arranged street with cars parked on it, and it would say terrible traffic or something. You know? So there's this like really strong actually imagination in the context of architecture and planning, you know, from independence onward, which is very anxious about the development of the city. So sometimes it feels irrational, but I think that is a really good question, because I actually think this is something I'd like to understand better, and not just in the context of Bangalore. You know, of course, there's the discourse about mud and other alternative technologies, but are there other contrary positions that are taken against concrete, or critiques made of it, right? That don't merely embrace it. Because I think, you know, if I recall, I mean, a lot of the discussions back in the 60s and 70s were also about access and things like this, but that's not what you're talking about.
Hi.
I am
I'm Malak, and I teach here at this college. I am in my practice looking at the proliferation of cement and concrete in a slightly different area, in the small villages and in hamlets, in tribal hamlets, which is a very different context from probably the cities which you're looking at, or say bigger towns or smaller towns. And this proliferation of cement is something which, I mean, to just from what Prasad asked you, he just asked you this question: are there positions taken? Was there any kind of organized kind of action to counter this? So I've been grappling with this question about how the landscape, how the built form is very quickly changing in the villages, in smaller villages, in hamlets, tribal settlements, and how cement is really proliferating in the housing typology in these areas. And the concerns and the questions there are very interesting. They have to do with mainly aspiration.
With what?
Aspiration. It has
right.
cement. A cement building has aspirational value. As uncomfortable, as unhealthy as it may be, with the knowledge, I mean, people live with that knowledge just because it stands for something. It's a symbol of progress, of affluence, and they associate it with some kind of status and social security. On the other hand, the government is trying to push this in a very organized way, where they're giving these free housing things in villages, but there's a condition that you have to build it in cement. So people just take it because it's free, and the money is made by all the agencies in between, the contractors, the local authorities, and all these guys. So proliferation in these areas is very different. Right now, it's happening very fast, as opposed to what you mentioned in your presentation, where it took almost 30 to 40 years in Bangalore, for example, for cement and concrete to be taken seriously from the time it started. Here, it's changing really, really fast in these small places where these are not their concerns. They're not even concerned about, what it will look like, what is the whole. For them, it's just to establish themselves as, at some kind of status compared to the others. Just wanted to share that.
Well, it's also but it sounds like that's also expected of them, in the sense of taking government assistance is tied to it, is what you're saying, right?
Sorry, can you just can't hear you?
Okay, well, no, I'm saying that like taking assistance from the state means that they have to use, they have to build in concrete. But I think that's interesting. Well, I mean, we were talking about this the other day, that even in the census, there are these distinctions between there's the national census, but then also I was saying that in the regional censuses from the 1920s and 30s onwards, there was distinctions made between paka and kacha materials, but differently. I mean, sometimes the floor, the walls, the roof. So something that is just worth thinking about. I mean, I don't have a conclusive. I don't have a conclusion to this yet, but it's interesting to think about whether it's the roof or the floor, but also even in the way that the government, whether it's state governments or the national government, evaluate and analyze architecture as a social medium. It's through these distinctions.
Yes.
So in some ways, there's the issue of aspiration, absolutely, but there's also this. It's also structural in some way. It's anticipated by the very ways in which the state makes sense of architecture.
Yes, indeed.
So, and I think that's actually that's something I to be honest, it's been at the periphery of my research in the past, but I'm very interested in now, and I think it's something that to keep thinking about, even in the context of contemporary India, because like you're saying, I mean, I don't think it's just tribal hamlets. I mean, I think the rapidity of architectural production today is also just itself remarkable, you know, even in the place where we sit. So I think it's a great comment, though. Thank you.
Do we have any last questions? Okay, I think that has been a wonderful discussion, and thank you, Curt, for tracing the history of plaster and kind of helping us think through how the material shift has shaped our imagination of the city. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining today. And our next lecture will be next Friday by Sanjay Prakash. We'll definitely kind of put it up online and the details of the event. But please stay tuned to our website and Facebook page for more details and events that we are hosting. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. Good evening.